Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 3. Our topic for this week is contextualizing bilingualism. We've covered a lot of ground so far. So this week, we're really just going to be reviewing some of the more, I don't know, maybe the trickier things that you are unfamiliar with. A lot of the chapters we're looking at things from you might have already studied in previous APLING programs. So if this was a little bit of a review for you, that's great. And then, so now let me just get into a quick recap of last week where we talked about defining bilingualism. And we talked about this idea of some of the difficulties behind whether or not we are multilingual or not, and what that has to do with the different ways that we use multiple languages and in what situation. So what is the what do we have, what languages do we have access to in what situations or not? So for instance, I have access to Spanish in certain instances, but other times I don't. If I'm around Spanish speakers, my Spanish is a little bit better, but if I was to just be forced to kind of like speak Spanish right now when I'm kind of in English mode, I wouldn't necessarily have access to it. Excuse me. And we also talked about how in our discussion board, how it's very seldom that you come across somebody that's equal, balanced, bilingual. Instead, we have different resources for different parts of our lives and different contexts, like I alluded to. And we also talked about this idea of language as a construction, which stems from this kind of nation state ideology, which is the idea about that Weinrich quote, sometimes called the Weinrich witticism, which is language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So it's very much a socio-political issue. And actually in our discussion board, we're going to go into a deeper dive about this quote. So I'll stop there. And then finally, we talked about Garcia's approach in the discussion board as well, and her thesis that bilingual education is the only way to educate children in the 21st century. And finally, talking about monoglossic versus heteroglossic models of bilingualism, where she talks about the dichotomy about, balanced bilingual, and that she talks about this in terms of the metaphor of the bicycle versus the moon buggy, the ATV. And yeah, so we got a lot of information. We've got a lot of new cool stuff that we're learning about. And I think, yeah, let's just pivot to the readings for this week. So in the concept of languaging as a practice, I want you to remember the difference between language as a noun and languaging as a verb. And this is kind of the difference between communication rather than a structure or a system. So this is the doing of language versus the thing, the entity, the abstract concept of language that is difficult to it's difficult to put your finger on. So the other thing that I wanted you to think about throughout this week is this idea of how would practicing language teachers begin to adapt their pedagogical approach as this idea of the languaging as a verb, languaging as a practice, as opposed to language as a structure. So think about this as we're going on through the material this week. How would you advise, or how would you even do it yourself? How would you adapt your teaching approach to incorporate this idea of languaging as a verb? Languaging also yields us to this notion of translanguaging. So translanguaging is this idea, well, Garcia cites Sen Williams, who is cited by everyone when you talk about translanguaging. But it's this idea of a pedagogical practice which switches the language mode in a bilingual classroom. So for example, one language is reserved for one activity and one language is reserved for another. So reading is done in one language and writing is done in another. So Garcia actually takes this quote and adapts it a little bit further, and she says, translanguagings are multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. So this is a really interesting thing because it kind of alludes to the definition of sociolinguistics that I talked about, I think last week or the first week, where sociolinguistics is an approach where you make sense of the world around you using language. And for Garcia, she adapts the Sen Williams quote and incorporates this identity component, which I think is really cool and a great example. A great example if you're trying to use, you need something a little bit more salient for you for the understanding translanguaging is the Pablo example about when his family is making rice and he calls the faucet the tube. So he's using the resources that he has in his English language. And so he's not trying to get stuck on the, trying to translate directly the word for faucet in English. He just uses what he has at his disposal. Yeah. Okay. So Garcia also reviews a ton of terms related to bilingualism that I'll include here. Oh no, I had a fun graphic. So let me do this. I wanted to use my cool new graphic. So ignore that slide. So the first one is the concept of interference, which has to do with second language development. Interference is this idea where you see traces of your first language happening in the second language. Today, we prefer to use the term transference rather than interference. They're basically trying to not pathologize it or make it like a deficit. Interference makes it sound like L1 is bad and it's interfering with the L2. Transference basically just gives equal weight to the first and second languages. So for example, if you look at the Pedro example, tube isn't worse than faucet. And then the next one that I'm sure you've seen either in other classes or in kind of the world today is this concept of code switching. So there are differences in types of code switching. So you can do intersentential code switching. So when sorry, I'm kind of tripping over my words. One sentence happens in one language and the next sentence happens in the other. Actually, what's really funny about this is if you're a syntax nerd like me, it could be clause. It doesn't necessarily have to be like super sentential. It could be clausal. So that's fun. If you're curious about that, please let me know. Intrasentential is when it's within one sentence. So you have two languages or more within one sentence. So if you said like, I'm going like Mayvoyal grocery store, that would be intrasentential. And so this next term is something in sociolinguistic literature that is really fun, and you'll start seeing it everywhere. But code switching has been discussed as something that people do to signal basically a shift or their stance or opinion about something or how they feel about a topic that they're discussing. So that's kind of basically a contextualization cue is that opinion about something. So how do we show how we feel about what we're saying? How we show that is through contextualization cues. So a very clear example is laughter is a contextualization cue. So if you're laughing and you're like, oh, shut up, and you go, oh, shut up, that's not as, weighted as if you just said, shut up. You know what I mean? So contextualization cue is how we mean what we say or how we feel about what we say. And so if you think about it in terms of code switching, if you code switch in a specific situation, you could be signaling to your interlocutor that you feel a certain way about what you're saying. So if I start speaking Spanish to my husband, let's say, in front of my parents, so my husband speaks Spanish, but my parents don't. If I start speaking Spanish about a certain thing, I could be basically like speaking in code is the wrong word right there, but I could be obfuscating some of my meaning so that I could, tell him that I don't want them to know what I'm saying. Contextualization cue is actually a term from John Gumpert's 1982. If you're curious about that, again, please email me. Yeah, so there's another really cool sociolinguistic model that she reviews for us, this Myers-Scott and markedness model of code switching. So basically, markedness is this idea where something is unusual or draws our attention to something. So if you are Deborah Tannen has a really cool example of markedness when it comes to gendered language. So for example, if you were to say something like actor versus actress, actress is the marked model because you're changing kind of the root word actor. So if you notice, a lot of people have been just trying to say actor for both male and female or non-binary performers. So you can just say actor as the quote unquote unmarked example of that. So when she talks about when Garcia talks about code switching and with respect to markedness, basically she's talking about that a marked code switch, so something that is salient or draws attention in the conversation, implies a renegotiation of rights and obligations between the participants. So this is a very similar idea to this idea of a contextualization cue, where you're kind of signaling how you feel about something using a code switch. So you're bringing attention to it. Okay, this last one, this last one I have a hard time with myself, and it's this idea of code mixing. And so basically she says that combining elements of language, of different languages, because the speaker doesn't know how to differentiate between them. I don't know. I'm not quite sure if I believe it or buy it or like it. So I wanted to bring this up because if you have an issue with this term, I kind of agree. So this is a word that you'll see in the literature, and I don't want you to use it in synonymously with code switching. I want you to use code switching, because code mixing I'm just kind of like about. So let's maybe, mark markedness, mark this as a term that is not necessarily like the best right now for us to use and might be a little troublesome. Cool. All right, let's keep going. Okay. So, okay, so in Garcia's definition of translanguaging, she basically is trying to get us to this her main central thesis of practice versus structure, right? So she's languaging as a verb as opposed to language as a noun. She says that our concept of translanguaging shifts the lens from cross-linguistic influence. So that would be the transference or interference proposal. It's intermingle linguistic features that have been administratively or linguistically assigned to a particular language or language variety. So she's really trying to emphasize this idea of making language or constructing a language where it's something that multilinguals do all the time when they're communicating. So this is something that is constantly being like adapted and signaled and all these things that we talked about with our terms here throughout language use for multilinguals. Okay. She gives us an overview of different models of bilingualism. So subtractive, additive, recursive, and dynamic. You might be familiar with some of these. So let's just briefly define them. And if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. So subtractive bilingualism is this idea with remember we talked about transitional bilingual education, where a student learns a second language, where you replace the first language. So basically, as the first language gets lost, the second language comes in. So that's why it's called subtractive. Additive would be the other case, where a second language is added, but the first language is also maintained. So this is the bilingual education programs that have like more immersive qualities. So things like where Canada, where English is the dominant language spoken, but learning French is a second language, but they're still maintaining their first language. Yeah, so this is the other idea of where somebody speaks a quote unquote like societally dominant language and is learning an extra one for their own purposes or interests. This is another one that I think is really interesting. It could also be called elite bilingualism, because as we alluded to last time, certain people are kind of quote unquote allowed to be bilingual or multilingual and not have it be frowned upon, whereas other people are not. But multilingual and bilingualism in the US has been considered an issue or a problem in the past, and now it is becoming more elite to be bilingual or multilingual, but only for certain people. Okay, recursive bilingualism is this idea associated with societies where one language is undergoing or has undergone a language shift, and one language is being lost. So a bilingual education model is introduced to maintain the language that was being lost. So this is something that you would see in New Zealand that I alluded to with my work with the Maori, where they're trying to revitalize certain language. They're trying to revitalize the Maori language through immersive programs and other things, like, societal changes and a bunch of other stuff. The dynamic model is kind of in line with her heteroglossic idea of bilingualism, but basically that today's globalized world, people use different languages and different repertoires for different purposes, and they communicate in different ways in different contexts. So this dynamic model brings us to the idea of operating that ATV, that moon buggy, where you have different repertoires and get things done differently. Okay. Cool. So what I alluded to before about who is allowed to be bilingual is kind of this idea of labeling speakers. So, and I'm sure you have too, and some of our bilingual classmates have talked about this, but what difference does it make how you label somebody who's learning another language? So you've heard limited English proficiency, I'm sure, or second language learner, as opposed to, non-native language learner, heritage language speaker. What about emergent bilingual? Yeah, so I think I want you all to think about this too, because I, as a foreign service, so my husband's the foreign service officer, but I get to travel with him. So when we're traveling overseas and we're living and stationed in a place, we're called expats, expatriates, but I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant whenever I'm over there in another host country. So I have to, I am treated differently, and I have to, like if I have to work, I have to apply for work visas as an immigrant and all these things. But I don't ever feel, as a highly privileged person, I don't ever feel the weight, quote unquote, that a lot of immigrants in our society are facing, because I am considered an expat, so that labeling is just so privileged and is reserved to a very certain class of people, and it is a huge problem. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and the idea of labeling speakers is fraught, and who is allowed to be bilingual and who isn't is a really fascinating conversation. So switching gears a little bit, we're talking about this idea of the major questions that comes up in bilingual development studies. And these are issues that, again, you've probably talked about in other classes. But when we're talking about studying bilingual development, some of the things that we're looking at are like confounding variables that we have to always address. So things like, are you forced to be bilingual? Are you learning the languages simultaneously or sequentially? When did you learn the second language? When was it introduced? And we'll talk about a lot is how much does the age really matter? So we've talked about critical period hypothesis before, and there are still a lot of questions trying to figure out how much age plays a factor in how we acquire a second language. And this is related to this notion of the bilingual brain. And so it's not that this book is super old, it's just that the research has been going, what's the word? Haywire? No, what's the word? Has been evolving super fast in the past few years when it comes to things like imaging studies and what we can see with respect to language acquisition. So we're not necessarily relying solely on aphasia studies anymore. We could look at fMRIs and more brain imaging. And so we can look at how brains of bilingual and multilingual speakers, how they're different from monolinguals. And it's very, very, very cool. So yeah, I think that this is a fun area if you're curious about. We'll definitely be talking about more. So I'll stop here for now because I think that there's like a lot of really cool stuff that we're talking about in the next few weeks. And I don't want to overload you with all this information because I know we talked about a lot today. So I'll pause here and we'll go to the Crawford chapters for next week. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll be posting the discussion board questions in the next few days. And I'm really excited to see what you all are talking about on the discussion boards. Thank you again for your hard work, and I'm excited to talk more about this. Thank you, guys.